What's up guys, how you all doing? So for today, I thought we might as well go outside because it's such a nice day. And I actually just bought these new ND filters which arrived today. They really help for us filming in the sunlight, so I thought it might be a good idea to film right now. So when I was younger and I just started filmmaking, I really wanted to film in slow motion, but I didn't really understand how it works and like what goes behind filming cinematic slow motion. So I would have absolutely killed to be able to get a video like this where it explains exactly how it works. So I decided why not make one now that I know. So without further ado, let's get started. So first, to be able to understand how to shoot cinematic slow motion, there's three things we have to talk about. Frame rates, shutter speeds, and how frame rates and shutter speeds work together. I know it's basically 2 points, so the third one is the first two. You know what I mean. So what are frame rates? Well, a frame rate is the rate at which a frame is captured by the camera. So 24 frames per second is 24 frames being captured by the camera every second. And 60 frames would be 60 frames captured by the camera per second. So 24 frames per second is the rate at which I shoot most of my videos because it's actually the closest to what the human eye sees. So technically it's 23.976, but 24 is close enough. So this camera, my Canon 90D, shoots at 24 frames per second, and I don't speed it up, I don't slow it down. Whatever goes into the camera goes straight onto my timeline, nothing changes at all. However, if I increase my frame rate from 24 frames per second to 60 frames per second, then I'm able to slow the footage down by 40% because 40% of 60 is 24. You can also do it on 120 frames per second, but not all cameras have that feature. Some cameras even only film at 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. In my opinion, that kind of sucks because you'd have to actually fake the slow motion, but you know, we'll talk about that in another video. So similarly, if I was shooting at 120 frames per second, I could slow down the footage to 20% because 20% of 120 is, you guessed it, 24. It's all about bringing it back down to that base frame rate of 24 frames per second. So now onto shutter speed. So shutter speed is how long the shutters open. If you have a shutter speed of 1/50, it means it's going to be open for a 50th of a second. Same for 1/25 means it's going to be open for a 25th of a second. The longer that the shutter is open for means more light is able to reach the sensor, which means that the image is going to be brighter. And also the longer that the shutter is open for means more motion blur is going to be in the image. So if it's open for like 1/25, so 25th of a second, then you're going to get a lot of motion blur. But if you have your shutter open for something ridiculous like 1/8000, it's just going to look too crisp and too sharp. It'll look unnatural and won't look realistic. So the important thing to remember is the longer the shutter speed means the image is going to be brighter and there's going to be more motion blur. Compared to the shorter the shutter speed, the image will be darker and will have less motion blur. Right, and now we have learning the knowledge of being able to use shutter speeds and frame rates together to achieve that cinematic look in your videos. There's this sort of rule, well, it's more of a guideline, where, for example, when you're filming at 24 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be double that. So optimally, it would be 1/48. However, that doesn't exist, so you would use the closest, which is 1/50. That's what I use when I make videos. I use 24 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/50. Now, this rule is called the 180-degree shutter rule. So if you're shooting something at a higher frame rate, let's say 60 frames per second, you're going to want your shutter speed to be at 1/120. That's because 60 times 2 is 120. However, the higher the frame rate, the more that rule kind of fades away. So a lot of the time when I'm shooting at 120 frames per second to get that super slow motion, I'm usually going to bump up my shutter speed really high, so 1/500 to even 1/1000 or more, depending on where I am. For example, if it's bright outside, then I'll be able to bring down that shutter speed, and then I don't need to use an ND filter. Now this is where it gets really interesting. This is where you get this cinematic look. So if I shoot at a high frame rate, like 120 frames per second, I'm going to bump up that shutter speed really high, much more than double, so that not much light comes in. But then I'll open up the aperture really wide so that I can isolate my subject. This will also brighten up the image again, so aperture is that focal length that you have, and the wider open it is, the shallower the depth of field is. If I have it really wide, then I can isolate that subject and the whole background will be really blurry. So this will create a sense of depth and make your footage a lot more cinematic. So once you've understood that 180-degree shutter rule and are able to adjust it to your style, there's endless possibilities and you can make your footage so much more cinematic. However, if you want to maintain using that 180-degree shutter rule in high frame rates, I would recommend using ND filters. So ND filters cut out light in an image. Watch. So you see the difference? So when you're using it in a frame, you can cut out that light without adjusting your shutter speed to keep that cinematic look anyway. So this will allow you to open up that aperture wide again to allow for that short depth of field, whilst at the same time maintaining all that motion blur in your image, which makes it look, again, more realistic. Anyway guys, that's the end of the video for today. I hope you all learned something from it, because I would have absolutely killed to get information like this when I was first starting off with filmmaking. If you enjoyed it, you can always press that like button and subscribe. Don't forget, if you believe it, you can achieve it. It was great hanging out with you guys, and I'll see you tomorrow.